So, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining this book conversation. This is a very interesting event because this is an event that at least some of us have been hoping would happen for a long time. Finally, Sandipan Chattopadhyay's works have been translated into English, and it gives me great pleasure to say that we have the translator with us, Professor Arunava Sinha. Just to give a brief introduction to his uh, absolutely mammoth work of translation from Bengali to English. Arunava Sinha translates classic, modern, and contemporary Bengali fiction and nonfiction from Bangladesh and India into English. He also translates books from Hindi and books into Bengali. Over 85 of his translations have been published so far in India, the UK, and the USA. He teaches at Ashoka University, where he's also the co-director of the Ashoka Center for Translation. He's also the books editor at scroll.in. Uh, Purnabuddha has had an illustrious career as a translator, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome him once again. Just to get us started on this trail of the translation of Sandipan Chattopadhyay, the reason I mentioned some of us have been hoping this event of translation will happen for a long time is that, if I'm allowed to share this slightly half embarrassing story, I don't know whether Shyom has joined. Shyom and I, a long time back when we were fresh out of our masters from Jadavpur University, we had gone to Shunil Gangopadhyay's place asking him to write a recommendation for the translation of Sandipan Chattopadhyay. Some of us were wondering if we could translate some stories and even the essays, some of the essays by Sandipan. And we were, seeking some sort of a validation, as it were, from the other writer of the same Krittibash generation, who happened to be more popular than Sandipan Chattopadhyay for sure. So, Krittibash, as a little magazine, was set up in the early 50s, and there are three, more than three, but of course, three major writers to have emerged alongside someone like Shyamal Gangopadhyay and others. One is Shakti Chattopadhyay, of course, Shunil Gangopadhyay, and Sandipan Chattopadhyay. I'm glad that we did not do the translation, and the translation was done by a much better and professional translator like Arunava. Now, just to begin talking about Sandipan Chattopadhyay, and the book that he has translated contains both his short stories and his novellas, though they've all been put together as tales. The book is published by HarperCollins. It's called 10 Days of the Strike. That's the titular story. We will, of course, talk about the book, but just for those of us who may not be very familiar with Sandipan, let me very quickly give you a sketch of the, the kind of writer he was and the kind of reputation he had. So, Sandipan Chattopadhyay was born in 1933. His year of passing is 2005. As I said, he belonged to that generation of the Krittibash Little magazine, along with Shakti and Shunil, and was quite instrumental in the early days of the Hungryalist movement, though dissociated from it later after the infamous court trials. Uh, Sandipan Chattopadhyay is particularly well known as, again, a lot of writers from that generation as a sort of anti-establishment, anti-institutional writer, which made his move to the newspaper and publishing house Ajkal somewhat suspect for some of the little magazine readership that was very loyal to him almost all his life. He wrote more than 100 short stories, more than 20 novels or novellas. Uh, some of perhaps his most significant book after all these years is still the first collection of short stories that made quite a stir. Kritodash Kritodashi. The story has been translated by Urnaboda in this collection. And, just to give you an idea about the interests he had, Sandipan was always a very international writer. In fact, sometimes to his perhaps discredit. He has been considered international to the point of not being considered Indian enough. We might come back to this discussion. And translation is a mode through which a writer, of course, gets a wider audience in the Indian context, given our polylingualism, multilingualism. It gets a pan-Indian audience, but also hopefully a global audience. These are certain things that we will talk about as we get into it. Without further ado, let me ask the first question to Arunava. Uh, when you were choosing these tales, let me call them tales in a way that encompasses both short stories and the two novels that or novellas that you have translated here, I support Arab Guerrillas and his 2002 uh, Academy winner, Bono Bihari and Amil Bono Bihari. When you were choosing these tales, what was the sort of the criteria that you had in mind? If I could start with that question. But maybe if I could attach a question, how did you come to Sandipan is another question I wanted to ask you to sort of get us started.
Sorry, what was the last bit? How did I?
How did you come to Sandipan? As in, what
Right,
made you choose Sandipan, the writer, as well as the internal choice of the stories in the book?
Right. So, of course, as you can imagine, in an ideal world, I would have liked to translate many more of his works. I even tried to negotiate with the publisher saying, can we do 2 volumes? I understand that 1 volume would be unwieldy with so many works. Well, we don't know whether there's going to be a volume 2. I suppose that depends on a lot of things, because I'm pretty sure that there could be another volume just as striking as this one quite easily, and maybe even one more, if not more. So the choice of stories was made by asking a few people for their suggestions, including Shyam, as it happens, and relying on my own readings of his works through the 80s and early part of the 90s, when I first came across him and started reading everything. So I did not read it, but I tried to go back to my memories of those works, because I felt that what I remembered might actually be a better pointer to what might be worth translating first. If I read them all over again, I would be even more confused than I was, because all of them would, the impact would be even greater, and perhaps with time, there would have been a new kind of impact. Of course, that new impact became evident as I was translating the stories all these years later, 30, 40, even 50 years later. Kritodashi came out in 61, I think. Yeah, so more than 50 years later. But so I picked a combination of suggested stories, 1 or 2 stories that really had stayed with me, and a sort of a jigsaw puzzle fit to ensure that the book came in at the right word length. But, there is no scientific method. I certainly, there was no literary parameter that I applied to pick some and not pick the others. And quite frankly, I will refute any suggestion that I pick these stories, in the sense that give me a chance and I will translate another set altogether. So I only I'd like to think of it as work in progress. When you'd also ask when I came across Sandipan first. Well, that's pretty interesting. After I graduated from college, in Jadavpur University English Department in 1985, soon after that, we started a city magazine in Kolkata called Calcutta Skyline. And one of the things that we used to do there was translate 1 short story for every issue every month. The first story, as it happens, was one by Shankar, which is what led him to ask me to translate Chorangi, but that's a separate story. But we were going through the writers whom everybody talked about that time. And as you can imagine, Sandipan Chattopadhyay was very much top of mind for those who read contemporary Bangla literature. In fact, more of our fellow students spoke of him than they did of, say, Sunil Gangopadhyay or even of Shishendu Mukhopadhyay and so on, right? He was by far the leading light in terms of, I think, what literature could do. So I mustered up the courage to one day go and meet him, along with our photographer who knew someone who knew someone who knew him. And so we went to his house in Chetla. And I first went to ask his permission to translate one of his stories, and because it had to be one of the shortest stories, and also we felt that it needed to be one of the more accessible stories, because at the end of the day, we were not a literary magazine, we were a general interest magazine. And it was more important for us that people read Sandipan Chattopadhyay in a form that would make some sense to them, and so that they could then get deeper into his other works, rather than throw them right away with one of his incredible stories that they would come back from asking what the hell was going on here. So I picked Bande Dosh Din, 10 Days of the Strike, which is also the titular story of this collection, and went and spoke to him. And he was very happy to allow it to be translated. And he talked to us about many things. And frankly, he didn't talk to us from any kind of exalted position or height, although he was a very tall man and I am not. But he spoke to us pretty much as though someone who was very glad to have found an audience. And he talked and he talked and he talked, and we hung on every word of his. And I don't remember exactly what he said, but it made naturally a very profound impression, because he did not talk in a high literary vein. He talked very much of the sordidness of life. Everything that he touched upon was in some fashion dirty, tainted, smelly. There was nothing beautiful in the conventional sense about the topics and themes that he touched on. So we went back and I translated the story, and I took it to him about a week or 10 days later, maybe 2 weeks later. And something happened that I was profoundly disappointed by. Although in retrospect, I realized that it was very stupid to be upset about it. But we went back to him on a Sunday. And those were the days when the Mahabharat serial used to be played on television on Sunday mornings. And I was very disappointed to discover that he was watching it. So it was a shock, because in my head, Sandipan Chattopadhyay couldn't possibly be watching Ravana. Who was it? B.R. Chopra. B.R. Chopra's Mahabharat. They were two separate universes. How is that possible? Of course, subsequently, I realized that that is exactly the person he was. He did not eschew anything in life at all. He lived everything every possible way, like every possible person. And he was certainly not a snob. And not only was he watching it, to my horror, he was humming along with that opening theme music, which go, the parts where, I'm not going to try and hum it, but you all of you know the tune, right? And then there was this voice, Srishti se pehle sach nahi tha, sach bhi nahi. And he was mumbling the words along and humming the tune. And I was ready to leave at that point. I'm like, what's going on? I can't reconcile this man, what I'm seeing with what he writes. Of course, I did not have the guts to ask him what the hell he was doing. But thinking about it afterwards, I realized that of course he was doing that. And he, whatever came on TV after that, he would also watch with equal interest if he was still watching television. And it was just a coincidence that it happened to be the Mahabharat at that point of time. And then he said, no, let's watch this together, and then I will read your translation. So for an hour we watched, and I watched him while he watched the episode. And then he sat down, he read the story, and then with a flourish, he signed it at the back saying approved. And he wrote Sandipan, not even Sandipan Chattopadhyay, just Sandipan. And to me, that was a huge thrill, because here I was, I was very young, obviously. And I was like, this man is referring to himself with his first name in my presence. And that to me is a big promotion. So, it was an encounter more of awe than of anything else, as you can imagine, because his writing had such a profound influence on our understanding of what literature could be. And precisely the point you made, that he was the first and perhaps one of the very few writers in Bangla who seemed to be writing in a global literary tradition, and not necessarily one that could be pinned down to Bangla writing or Indian writing in particular. So it was doubly exciting. And of course, because we were at that point, we had performed in a play where there was a line in the play which was Kaf Kakamu Sat, Kaf Kakamu Sat. And so everything we read, we tried to find Kafka, Camus, and Sartre in there in some fashion. At least echoes of it, or some allusion or something that would help us understand or at least place the work. And it was a great joy to read Sandipan Chattopadhyay and discover that he was talking very much about the sheer fact of existing without necessarily being guided by a philosophy or a doctrine or even any of the finer points of romance and so on. So yes, that was the encounter, and that was the first time I translated him. And I've wanted to ever since. My own work of translation then took a long break. In fact, I had no idea that I was going to ever get back to it or properly do it. But the opportunity came many years later. It came about almost 20 years later, more than 20 years later. And since then, I've been hatching a plot to translate his works, but it was difficult to find a publisher, and you can imagine why. So eventually, when Rahul Soni at HarperCollins agreed and said, "Let's do it," I was delighted because Rahul is the finest editor of translated works that I know. He has an excellent eye, and for me, it's a kind of validation. If Rahul wants to publish someone, then I know that that someone continues to be a great writer, even for today's readers. So that was how this book came to be.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's a very interesting story of Sandipan watching Mahabharata. But I wouldn't be surprised. There are references to the two epics in his works, but especially I can recall the dialogue with the crane as religion, Bakrupi Dharma, in Bharatvarsha, in India, the novel title India.
Yeah.
But to go back to, since you mentioned 10 Days of the Strike, that's a story that talks about dirt, right? I mean, bathroom getting clogged and and there's a sort of, I'm not going to spoil the story for readers who may not have read it, but there's a very strange way in which within the kind of sordid urban space, a very strong belief in what the maternal spirit could do in relation to the clogging of the toilet. I'll keep it enigmatic for the readers, but there's a way in which that belief functions, and that I feel is perhaps quite intrinsic to that moment of Sandipan watching Mahabharata. Because again, in that story, it's not that he falsifies that belief, that completely extra rational belief, when at the end, I don't think this is a spoiler, but when at the end the son says, "My dead mother has actually cleaned or unblocked the toilet," that moment is not a moment that the narrative kind of falsifies or presents as a lie. And that I feel is the interesting thing about a writer like Sandipan, who is urban and rational and all of that, but at the same time there's so much of this presence of the extra rational, the instinctive, perhaps the foremost being the sexual in his writing. There's the charge of whatever that is beyond rationality, as it were. But quite literally, he's a writer of toilet humor. There's so many stories about toilets and the excreta, as it were. The way Bijon Rokto Mangsho or Bijon's I think that's how. Let me see. Sorry, this is the problem of not having the book in book form, but I'm just going to check the way you've translated the title. I think it's Bijon's Flesh and Blood. Yes, Bijon's Flesh and Blood. The way that the story begins with, again, a sort of excretal function, as it were. But I wanted to ask you one thing. So it was kind of implied as a question in your answer too. It took a long time for someone to accept Sandipan's translation. And this delay is something that the Wire article, which has come out as a sort of review of the book, also mentions. Why is it that Sandipan was not translated earlier? And I'm kind of wondering if you have sort of response to that, why maybe.
Well, I mean, he would have been translated earlier had your and Shyam's project gone through. But I think, for example, Sandipan is not actually one of the names of Bangla Sahitya outside of Bangla reading, the world of Bangla readers. There are many others around the country who can toss off the name, even if they've not read anything from Bangla, they can toss off the names of half a dozen Bengali writers, but Sandipan will not be among them. And I think this is also true of editors and publishers. They too would have to furrow their brows and say, Sandipan who? So I think that's one of the reasons that when initially in the early days, when English language publishers were publishing translations from Indian languages and starting with Bangla, because many of the editors happened to be from Kolkata, and they were sort of plowing through the so-called canon, as it were. Sandipan did not figure in that canon. And precisely perhaps because of the fact that he fell out of the discourse, I think somewhere around the late 90s, early 2000s, so that it did not carry through in the worldview of Bangla literature from that editors and publishers had. And they actually had to read something to determine that there was something worth publishing there. And it is to Rahul. I mean, I'm so delighted that Rahul just read one story and decided that this is it. And to be honest, 10 Days of the Strike is, as you know, it's not even one of his quintessential stories. It is actually one of the more, shall we say, the ones with a more cogent narrative. There's a sense of a beginning and an end, and so on. And I don't know if the remaining stories stunned him or shocked him, because many of the things that he may have expected from this story were not to be found in the other ones. And even now, I don't know what the acceptance, what readers will feel. I've not really had any response except from about half a dozen people, and who have all told me, what did I just read? But beyond that, nothing. And in fact, it is hard to articulate your thoughts after reading Sandipan. You know that you've read something very extraordinary and special, and something that does not fit into perhaps your worldview of what you expect to read in India. And here's the thing, which is that you will read, however, stories from writers around the world that completely eschew conventional narrative, and that go into spaces that you will not normally encounter in the literatures of India, and you will read it without batting an eyelid. In fact, and laud it for it. But the moment it comes from India, it suddenly you start looking at it differently. People start, raising that point, or in their head somewhere they ask, so are these stories of the supernatural? Is there something going on there along those lines? Where do I which box do I put these stories in? So let's see. I'm hoping that there will be some discourse, some conversations, and that there will be something of a beginning to try and place Sandipan's works in the context of Indian literature, Bangla literature, and world literature.
Thank you. I just go back to one of the endorsements that comes from Anjum Hassan. And it's interesting that he mentions existentialism and locates Sandipan within literary modernism. So at the end, he says, how marvelous that Chattopadhyay's fervent young men, who must count as crown princes among the ranks of the disaffected in Bengali literature, now join in the mind and heart of the reader in English, other worthy existentialists from Indian literary modernism. Uh, of course, Sandipan calls himself Kamu Kator, again, a very weird and difficult kind of an alliteration to translate, I suppose. But at least I can't do that, which is why I leave it at Kamu Kator. And definitely the two initial stories have had that kind of reception. And if I'm not mistaken, Bijon's Flesh and Blood is the story that is now in the Bengali literature curriculum. And perhaps also Kritodashi, but I'm not very sure the story that you've translated as Slave Man, Slave Woman. But other than these two, there's also a very old favorite of mine, and it was a story that attracted a lot of writers to Sandipan, contemporary writers. I remember Ononno Roy being a huge fan of this story, and this is Mirabai, another story from 1960, the same time when Bijane Roktomangsho and Kritodashi were written. And I'm mentioning this particular story because this, in a way, presents a slightly different Sandipan. There's no denying the kind of androcentric perspective he takes in his stories very often, but we have at the very center of the narrative a sexually liberated woman almost recast as Mirabai, the saint Mirabai. And this is a sort of modern reinscription of the saint, as it were. But in extremely complex details, Sandipan again places sexuality with death, and as almost always, illicit relationships. It's there in Last Metro as well. The English translation, in a way, helps us understand the fact that Sandipan was also creating an echo of Truffaut's film, The Last Metro, Shesh Metro in Bangla. But I'm just generally, so these are two questions I have. One is this question of gender politics, which has been much talked about and a little bit controversial as well around Sandipan. It's interesting that the Wire article I read as a review at the end makes this comment that had it been for a different kind of a gender politics, maybe he would have been an even greater writer. That's the author's own assessment. I'm not going to go into that. But I'm just wondering, when you translated and while translating, how did you read the the masculinity at work in Sandipan, which is not, I mean, and on the one hand, it's a very strongly sexualized masculinity, but on the other hand, it's also deeply vulnerable masculinity, especially in Bijane Roktomangsho or Kritodash Kritodashi, and even in Mirabai, where the masculinity is almost passive. And at the center, we have this incredibly sexually liberated woman, as it were. So this is a question about gender politics and how you think as a translator it panned out, and the fact that the translator also has a certain gender identity, right? And how that might have a role to play in translation. Maybe it's also a slightly general question, but I would just like to know what you feel while translating Shondipan. How did you feel about this gender politics?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And particularly when you're translating today, in this day and age, you're obviously much more sensitive about the way the gender politics, or the male gaze, if you like, is being played out in the fiction, in the work that you're translating. But of course, as a translator, it is not your business to fix anything, or indeed to condemn in any way. So you have to be as true to the text as it was when it was written. And if, as a result of that, there's a certain way in which the story is read, so be it. Of course, the story will be read in a particular way in 2024 that will be quite different from the way it was read 50 years ago. And that is exactly what great literature should be, or any good literature should be about. And nor does good or great literature have to please every sensibility over the generations, over the years. But what was most interesting when translating was that at no point did I feel uncomfortable. And the reason for that, I thought about it, is that the masculinity which you described is very believable in the characters in these stories. And they're very much, they live in that particular time, and they are led by particular ways of living, particular modes of living, particular modes of thinking. And there is no gainsaying the fact that in the 1960s, in urban Calcutta, you were certainly not going to find men talking about women's rights or feminism or anything like that. And there would have been a continuous discourse about who could say the more clever things about women. And I think underlying everything was always the notion that women are wonderful creatures, but at the end of the day, we men are, we run the world. So that I found completely believable in the attitudes of the characters. But as you rightly said, what is missing from there is that machismo, or that belligerence, or any real effort or predetermined belief that we will decide what women will do. So the male gaze is very much there, but the male gaze is not a domineering and a cruel and an ownership-oriented gaze. And as you said, you see the vulnerability in all these men, and they are not successful men also by any conventional standards. I mean, in Shonko's books, you have successful corporate executives, but here these people are clearly failures by any yardstick that the capitalist world would lay down, right? They probably don't have many of them don't have jobs, but they're not romantics like Shunil's Nil Lohit. They are not necessarily happy with their mode of existence. But interestingly enough, and this perhaps is something that flows from the author himself, they're still very happy that they're alive and living. The very fact of being alive is a huge source of satisfaction and joy to them. And at no point, do they want to step back from that or talk about how bad life is, how lousy life is. There, you don't hear those complaints. There is an acceptance of the fact that things are difficult. In the last Metro, the protagonist accepts the fact that his girlfriend will actually be marrying someone else, and he knows he's not suitable enough to present himself as a groom. So these things automatically lead to the vulnerability that you spoke of, the awareness of the flaws in themselves. And all of this adds up. The one thing I found as a translator trying to ensure remained in the translation was the tenderness. In a very unexpected way, there is a great deal of tenderness in the way always the male narrator talks about the other people, even, and the women in particular. So when the narrator is talking about Mirabai, you can see that softness, that tenderness. At no point does he think she's a slut or anything like that. It's not that kind of a viewpoint at all. So it's a male gaze in the sense of being a gaze that has been shaped by existence as a male, but it is not a machismo, macho, I control everything kind of male gaze. That is what I felt when translating in particular, because I dare say that a translator reads the text even more closely than the writer themselves. The writer at least is writing, but the translator has to make sure that, or tries to make sure that they're getting the text in every possible way that it is intended. So you do read very closely and slowly, and you're very clear of the effect. And in this case, it did not cause discomfort in me. In very sharp contrast, for example, I'll give you a completely unrelated comparison. When I was translating Tungabhadra Tire, it was very clear that the worldview in that narration was deeply anti-Islam. And no, there was no mitigating factor about it, nothing. It was taken as a fact of life. So that was very, very troubling. But I did not feel any such thing here.
Thank you. In fact, on that note, let me just for the audience, let me read a little section from your translation of Last Metro, which I think is an example of this tenderness that you're talking about. At one level, Sandipan, perhaps in spite of himself, remains a very romantic writer, and we see that in this prose. I love the perforated grains left behind after tearing out a sheet from a pad. I love history. Is that not loving you? I love the one who has given you those scratches beneath your eyes. I love time. I love the music of 100 waterfalls. Is that not loving you? You've been close to me, so I tell you, from planet to planet is drawn a silent, timeless web. I should add that this sentence is a translation of one of Shankar Ghosh's poems that Shandipan intercuts here. And unquote, I love poetry. Is that not loving you? You have been close to me, so I tell you. Again, this is a Shankar Ghosh quote. In the flow of time, there remains a venomous, treacherous, hidden current, unquote. This constant competition to outstrip one another suits the tall, cruel pine trees. Does it suit humans? I believe in those humans who turn their face away. Is that not loving you? You've been close to me, so I tell you, across the three parts of the world that is water, a gigantic bell will rise one day. All these countless numbers of people have collected by the seashore only to listen to the ineffable notes of this awakening. Can you deny that they have gathered? Do any of them have sunglasses on? Come, what are you afraid of? I love them. Is that not loving you? This is how the last metro ends. And I'll ask you another question, but before that, just to maybe make a quick point about this gender politics. Having read Sandipan for a number of years, what I feel about this is that on the one hand, he shows a male gaze that is very quick to sexualize the woman. On the other hand, as we have in the last Metro itself, we have a feminine counter voice that resists this sexualization. Like Shelley in this story says, I'm happy to live with an impotent man, but I cannot be mentally alone with a man. I am happy to have a certain kind of sexual solitude, physical solitude, but I cannot take mental solitude. And in that statement, Shelley, in a way, refutes that sexualization that the male gaze is kind of trying to impose on her as a human being. And I think this is why Shandipan is a very interesting writer. Unlike someone like Nobarun, for example, he has very strong women. Like Pratibha in Amiyo Bonobihari is a very strong character. And even though she perhaps does not get as much voice as she could, a large part of the narrative is about Pratibha and Pratibha going blind. And that wonderful moment of memory, for example. I will ask you a question about Amiyo Bonobihari in a moment. But before that, I also wanted to, in fact, ask you I, I get what you're saying, and it is a fact that Sandipan in late 90s and early 2000s somehow started being less talked about. But I find this very curious because if you notice, this is the time when he got the Sahitya Academy and the Bankim Purushkar. 2002, Amiyo Bonobihari, he got the Sahitya Academy, right? And I can't exactly remember, but perhaps soon before or just after he got the Bankim Purushkar, you would, my memory is not serving me well on this. But anyway, so I was kind of wondering why this may have happened. I know that in within the Bengali literature community, there's often a kind of reduction of Sandipan Chattopadhyay to an extremely charged sexual right. But then the point I'm kind of trying to push through, especially for the audience, and hoping some of you are potential first-time readers here, there is a lot more in Sandipan. And in the translated works that we have in this book, as well as in the untranslated works. Like, for example, in some of the late texts, the way he cuts up Sharadindu's Raktosandha in Swarge Nirjan Upakule and produces a very complex narrative that goes back to Portuguese colonialism in India, and kind of a strange Oedipal tale between the father and the daughter. But it also brings me to the next theme I wanted to mention and ask you a question about. So, one question is why do you think at the time when he got some sort of nationwide acclaim in some sense as a Bengali writer, he fell out of discourse? The second question is about this recurrent theme of murder and crime in Shandipan's writings. You've translated Ivy Shom case, which is a strangely written whodunit, not exactly a whodunit. In fact, he calls it a post-mortem, right? So it's written in that sort of report-like form, as it were. But this theme of crime, which has maybe ontological implications, but sometimes in a very strange way, murdering the other for Shandipan or Shandipan's characters is like murdering oneself. And we get that sense in Ivy Shom's story as well. Uh, would you like to say something about this theme of crime? Because in a way it exists in Kritodashi as well, in that sort of memorable scene where we have the murder of a candle as a sort of symbolic representation for murder. Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I'm not a literary expert in general, and certainly not on Sandipan. For me, all translation is a challenge of and problem of language rather than of literature. In fact, I prefer to keep the literature out of it because then you might start overthinking and then overwriting as a result of it. I'm led by the text. Whatever the text is telling me at that point for translating is good enough. Of course, with someone like Sandipan, you also have to be aware of the intertextuality. So that's important, as you said, lines from Shankar Ghosh's poem. And indeed, his entire work, I mean, he himself has said that I have only one story. And in a sense, many of the characters also seem to be all the same person. And Bonobihari and Ami, in that sense, it's quite aptly titled. And of course, in Bonbihari's case, as you said, the strongest character in that story is, of course, Pratibha. It is not Bonbihari at all. So that kind of really balances out the male gaze that we were talking about. But as for this point about crime, I mean, now that you mention it, I realize. So what do you think? Do you think it's a way of it's in a way an instrument by which he explores certain aspects of the psyche, certain aspects of human nature, and a crime is a tangible uh, manifestation of such an aspect of human nature? You've studied him and read him to much greater depth than I have. I think, Orko, you should answer this question.
No. I'll be brief because I'll put to you a question about translation, which is fairer in this context. But very quickly, I agree with you. I think this is what it is. In fact, in Ivy Shom's story, there is a reference to Pamu's outsider, and it's a slightly funny reference in the sense that the narrator seems to say, "Oh, he didn't read Outsider. Otherwise, he would have mentioned that." The
Yeah.
criminal seems to mention only Dostoevsky and something else, but not Camus. And I think there is a sort of existentialist way of understanding that idea of murder in Sandipan as a kind of suicide, that murder itself is a form of suicide, as it were,
Mm,
which kind of
mm,
puts it back to the
mm,
self. But to be fair to the logic of the conversation today, let me ask you a question about translation. Sandipan is also considered a very complex prose stylist. So when you were translating him, like for example, I was thinking about that's one of my most favorite stories, Biplabo Rajmohan, the Revolution and Rajmohan. I think that's how you rendered it. Uh, in stories like that, for example, there is that moment where he says, "I've never picked up a gun," but he says it in a passive voice. He says, "A gun was never picked up," as it were. If I remember correctly, you used the word manifest to translate that particular sentence, that it did not manifest in my hand, as it were, the gun. And
mm,
also that little dwelling on the word ononnopai, the way he breaks that word in that
mm,
same page, on the same page, if I remember correctly, that's the first page of the story. Such a lexically conscious writer, linguistically conscious writer, someone who often writes about language, as it were,
mm,
writes something and says, maybe the tense could have been this. এরকম লিখলে better হতো, something like that. I'm remembering a sentence in ধ্বংসের মধ্যে দিয়ে যাত্রা. But what is it to translate such a linguistically conscious writer and such an ornate kind of a prose stylist, someone who arguably went back to Bankim Chandra to sort of, and Manik Bandyopadhyay and Kamal Kumar Majumdar to seek a sort of alternate Bengali style, not to mention Jibananando's Upannashas or novels that he discovered later, and he called them novels of bare existence. So I'm just wondering, what is it to translate such a conscious prose stylist, and what were the challenges involved?
Well, of course, you're spot on. When you read Shandipan, you're straight away aware of the style and the fact that you have to protect it through and through in the translation. You cannot simplify, you cannot chop it into pieces, you cannot do to it what you might be tempted to do, because the new language in which you are writing it sometimes will not accommodate the structures that the original language offers. But it's not as though, fortunately for me, Shandipan also does not use natural rhythms of Bangla, of everyday Bangla. So in that sense, because he's already creating something that sits outside the day, his vocabulary is very here and now, but the way the words come together is a form that you will not encounter. So it gave me the leeway to also similarly use everyday words in English, but assemble them in a way that would not necessarily be natural to the rhythms of English. And indeed, it is a prose that you have to stumble over. You're meant to stumble over. You're not meant to read so smoothly that you ignore individual words and phrases. He deliberately slows you down so that you can appreciate everything that's going on. So it was a three-step process. First, I had to, of course, ensure that the content, as it were carried through into English. The second point was that because some sentences were inordinately long, and sometimes you're moving very quickly from one thing to another, and yet you must not make the reader feel that I've lost my way and now I no longer feel like continuing. So my method in such cases is usually to first break down long bits into smaller chunks, translate each of them, and then reassemble them. Reassemble them in a way that ensures that the richness and the complexity of the text is not abandoned, but at the same time that there is a certain degree of legibility. At the same time, it cannot also take the English language to a point where you're no longer thinking of it as English at all. So when you read Sandipan in Bangla, it's not that he takes you to a point which sometimes Kamal Kumar Mujumdar does, where you almost stop thinking of it as the Bangla Bhasha anymore. Not just because of the abstruseness of his vocabulary, but also because of the way he brings it all together. But you can't afford to do that because that's not what Sandipan is doing. And you don't want the English version also to do any such thing or to create an opacity for the sake of opacity. So this is actually why we translate. These are the reasons we love doing what we do, because there's challenges come our way and we have to find good solution to them. Now, whether we are successful is up to the reader to decide. And of course, translations are not for the reader who are reading both languages. So no concessions are to be made. Nobody can read a translation and say, oh, I know the original was really complicated, so maybe this is the best that could be done. It's going to be read by someone who will judge the prose as though it was written in this language, although they know at the back of their head that it was not. If you read an awkward sentence from Gregory Rabassa, you would blame Gabriel Garcia Marquez, not Rabassa. So that's a big responsibility, therefore. But then this is what we live for, quite honestly.
Thank
and
you.
It's not, you cannot bypass these challenges or cop out of them for the sake of easy accessibility or readability. You have to take them on head on. And that's what I think I tried to do with Sandipan's prose. And that's what makes translating him such a joy.
I have two questions. One, a slightly more general one that is a little bit more specific, but I think perhaps these are the last two questions from me. We could have a conversation after this with the audience. So the general question is, when HarperCollins translates writers like Sandipan, you've translated Robi Shankar Ball for them, if I'm not mistaken, in the past.
That was Penguin.
Right. That was Springer. Okay. I think HarperCollins has also translated Shubimal Misro.
Yes.
I'm just generally thinking with Bengali literature, one modality of translation is to make it reach the entire country, as it were, which is the Sahitya Akademi model of translation, where the idea is other languages or other linguistic literary traditions and readers of those traditions will read this. But with HarperCollins, I think there is an additional agenda of making it available to readers outside India. But, since you've been working with them for some time and you worked with most other major publishers that have translated Bengali fiction, it's not a question that is only about Sandipan. It's a general question where I'm kind of wondering to what extent this actually happens. Of course, I'm not talking about the academic reception where professors outside India might read these things and write articles. That would happen, I know. But other than that, do these writers go outside India as much as they should, or as much as we would like to believe on paper with these translations? I know it's a slightly blunt question. I'm sorry.
No. And it's a great question. And it's a question that causes us much heartache because no, they don't. Although these are multinational publishers, they publish them only for the Indian subcontinental territory. And the way publishing works, as you know, is that you need to pick up rights for other regions as well. Now, HarperCollins technically will often have world rights for the books that they're publishing in India, but they don't have HarperCollins India does not have a publishing presence in other Anglophone markets. So it will have to be a publisher there who will want to publish the book. And that publisher could be HarperCollins UK, or it could be someone altogether different. Very few of translated works from India have actually made it out to these Anglophone markets. Maybe in all, from the beginning of the time that these books began to be published in India seriously, I don't think more than 35, 40, maybe 50 at the outside, probably not even more than 3 dozen books have gone out there. And the reason for that is many. There's a lot of gatekeeping that goes on in the West. Publishers are big publishers, either big publishers who have most of their eyes trained on what they think the market will receive, and books from India are not yet in that space where there's curiosity, unlike, say, books from Japan or Korea. I'm leaving Europe out because that's a contiguous cultural space. So it's the gap, or the wall is not very high for them to vault over. And as for the independent publishers, other than Tilted Access and to a smaller extent, one or two others, most of them have not really tried to look at Indian writing. Also, the independent publishers tend to look at only living authors because they are very much into contemporary writing. So Sandipan fits in neither here nor there. You cannot position him as a classic writer yet. And that's simply a function of time more than anything else. Nor can you position him as a contemporary living writer, because obviously he's not. So yeah, only people who are interested, or there's some word of mouth, small community that is interested in reading the literatures of India will get to read them. Whether it is, as you said, Sandipan or Ravi Shankar Ball or anybody else. So one of the writers who is now being read to some extent, or at least being published to some extent in the West, is Perumal Murugan, whose Tamil publisher has done wonders in talking to publishers abroad and getting them to publish him. Other than that, there's not been a great deal in recent times. There's been Shongita Bandyopadhyay, 3 of her novels were published by Tilted Access. And then the odd writer here and there. Vivek Shanbag, 2 of his novels have been published abroad. Some of J. Mohan's works will be published. So that's about it. But also, you see, that's the other interesting thing, which is that the moment you start talking about literature from India, there is this notion, there is this certain expectation of it, and a very, caste and some kind of rural setting, or something that is not quite very familiar to the Western world. Now, Sandipan's novels are set in urban India, in a city. Admittedly, they're very sordid and tawdry, but precisely because he is part of a global tradition, he is less attractive to those who want to publish a book because it is written by an Indian writer.
Right. Yeah, that's a very interesting irony.
Yeah, the irony is palpable.
Yeah. I just want to ask one last question, which is specific to Amio Bono Bihari, but I think it's true for a lot of his writings. He's also someone, Sandipan, who writes in multiple styles within the same word. So there are these long passages of political documentation that are written in a very straightforward, almost, not so nice Bengali. It's kind of, it's a bit tortuous to read on occasions. And then there are these extremely mellifluous passages where, especially the narrator is talking about Pratibha going blind. And towards the end, that absolutely chilly encounter with Ding and Dong in quite literally the underbelly of Calcutta, as it were, in a sort of infernal Kafkaesque setting. But it's such a wonderful novel also because it uses cinematic form. It has that scenic division, and then there are sections. The entire novel is very self-reflexive and almost writes itself as a cinematic text, as a screenplay, a pattern that we see in some of the late works as well. Now, I was just kind of wondering, as a translator, when you encounter these different styles, is it always an attempt to reproduce the multiplicity of styles? I guess the attempt would be there, but how to do that is, I guess, the question that I'm trying to ask.
So, yes, it's always a question of being led by the text and the style that you discern. In fact, so much so that you even forget it's the same writer. And the moment you tell yourself that, you're fine. Because then, as a translator, it is your job, after all, to imitate the voices of many different writers, or at least the voices many different writers have used in their specific texts. And so it's not an extra challenge in that sense. I mean, when you're translating the text, you're actually translating the text, and that's it. You're not really thinking of the writer in any way. So it's not a problem. Each style poses its own challenge, of course, which you have to deal with. But the transition is not a source of concern.
Okay.
Or
Right.
the multiplicity of styles. That's not a problem in itself.
Right. Right. And just one last thing I want, it's not really a question, but it's something that I noticed while reading through the uh, the electronic copy, that Amio Bono Bihari, or especially the novels, I mean, all his novels had dedications, right? And also a little paratext at the top. Uh, that has been left out. Is there a particular reason why it was left out, or was it a deliberate decision to leave it out?
No, neither. It was just to let the text flow as a collection, rather than make each look like a standalone thing. I know that a little bit is lost in not using those, but eventually we arrived at an editorial decision
Right.
not to break it and let it flow from one story to the other.
Right. So the
They've
reason
also
I'm
been
asking,
positioned as stories, as you can see,
yeah,
strictly speaking. But again, that was, you can't really leave out some of the novellas, because they're luckily of the length that can be accommodated.
Hmm. Yeah, the reason I asked is, of course, the 2002 novel Amir Bono Bihari has this kind of once we read the novel, we know that it's an ironic dedication to Buddhadev Bhattacharya, the chief
Yeah,
minister of West Bengal
yeah,
at that
yeah.
point, and because the entire novel offers a sort of internal critique of the party line. But it's a very interesting moment, and maybe to finish this conversation on an anecdotal note, I remember this story that I think Audrish Vishwas once told me in our Being and Becoming with Sandipan Chattopadhyay. I saw him a couple of times. I never had the guts to go and talk to him. He was very senior at that point. I once saw him in Coffee House, and strangely enough, once in uh, Digha, if I'm not mistaken, where my father showed that that's Sandipan Chattopadhyay, walking with his perhaps family or whatever. Anyway, but there's an interesting anecdote I heard, I think from Adrishta, who said once that Buddhadev Bhattacharya had asked a kind of a question, but also it was a bit of a joke about that title of his novel, Double Bedeaka, Alone on a Double Bed, and made a bit of a remark about the fact that, oh, he's so kind of obsessed with sexuality at the end of the day. And Sandipan made a very interesting response, which I think speaks to the way sexuality is never really sexuality for Sandipan. Uh, he said, when a corpse is preserved, there are two chunks of ice, and between those two chunks of ice, the corpse is alone. If you ask me, that is double bedeaka. That is the idea of being alone on a twin bed. And that, I think, kind of goes back to how complexly he treated that theme of sexuality, and how perhaps, sometimes unsexually, if I may say so, he treated that in all its politics and the broader idea of sexual liberation
Yeah,
that I
and
think, yeah,
I also have a suspicion that he enjoyed the fact that people read more sexuality into it, or more obvious, blatant sexuality into his works, where he liked needling them.
yeah,
And he liked the fact that they were needled. And there was the automatic assumption that this was a market facing ploy, or that there is something morally unsound about the person. And, it makes you feel superior, either as a writer or as a reader. I don't write cheap stuff for the market, or I don't think about such things, whatever such things might be. But you know what
yeah.
middle class Bengali morality was, for all its claims at um, being very revolutionary.
Yeah. And
Actually,
that's precisely the subversive nature of his writing, right? That he challenges the hypocrisies of that liberated
Exactly.
imagination, so-called liberated
Yeah,
imagination.
and in a sense, he was telling everybody, and I think this is also what readers would have been uncomfortable about, that they could also look within themselves
Yeah.
at the tawdry side of their own personalities, and they were surely not comfortable having it looking in the mirror in this fashion.
Yeah. Okay, I think we have been speaking for almost an hour, so this is a good time to perhaps open it up. I think anyone can unmute themselves and also put a question in the chat box, whichever they like. Uh, Questions, comments, anything that you would want Arunava to talk about, perhaps something that we didn't get the time to cover, or any general questions.
Also, I do
It's
have two questions, but I will let students ask first because, if there
sure,
are
sure.
students wanting, or then because I do have two questions. And
I mean, why don't you go ahead, Shomita? I
right,
mean, yeah.
okay. No, I don't want to hijack the thing.
No, no, it's all right. It's all right. I mean, they'll get
Okay.
some more time to gather their thoughts, maybe.
Mrs. Sinha, it was wonderful listening to you. I have two questions, and this is pertaining to translation. This is Sharmita again.
Yeah.
So, one is you did mention this as a part of your conversation with Orko that, when a text in an Indian text is translated, and there are certain expectations in terms of the Western audience, right? The global audience. And if they're not made, as you said, caste or rural settings and things like that, then I mean, there is not so much keenness. It's related to that because in terms of, this debate about in writing in Indian languages and also, Indian English writing, one of the things that people like Izaz Ahmed, they have claimed is that even when the best works are translated and the translations are very beautifully done, sometimes it's mostly that the sensibility of those works are not something that readers I mean, who are not familiar with Indian culture or the Indian ethos, they're unable to comprehend that sensibility. And as a result, those works, even when they're adequately translated, they do not get that response that perhaps Indian English writers do get. And since you have done such a plethora of translations, I mean, I could understand how somebody, I mean, like you have translated such a vast array of works, like, from Chorongi to Tagore to, Srinivas Gangotpadyay. So what would your take be on that?
Well, my thinking is that it is absurd to expect someone who does not live in a particular culture to get everything about a work that's created in that culture, right? Whether
Mhm.
it is a book or a film or a piece of music or food or anything for that matter.
Mhm.
But just because a reader will not, from a different space, will not necessarily um, relate to the text the same way as someone who lives in the same space will, I don't think should be a reason for it not to be appealing. Then there is probably something missing either in the text or in the translation. I mean, you know, I know that there is a certain, we have all grown up reading world literature, right? And
Exactly.
and maybe at one level we read all of this and accepted it because we had an inbuilt sense of inferiority that world literature is the best, and we how dare we think of it as not being our kind of writing because we don't understand the world in which it is set.
Right.
Maybe some of that played a part, but if you look back on your own reading, I don't think we had any problem appreciating the greatness of works which were set in spaces and time which we had never seen. And remember, we were reading at a time when we were not aided by images on television or cinema or anything.
Right. I mean, I could relate to Jane Eyre as much, and this is what also Spivak says at one point when she
Yeah,
was reading Jane Eyre, right? I
yeah,
literally wander around with that British girl anywhere, like where she was wandering
exactly.
around, right?
Exactly. And for that matter, who's to say that just because someone is a Bengali will today, will be living in exactly the same space that Sandipan lived in 50 years ago.
True.
And just the continuity of language doesn't ensure that at all. And not even continuity of language, I'll say continuity of vocabulary, nothing more than that.
Mhm.
So I don't know about that being the reason for works not being accepted or acknowledged or read with the due attention that perhaps they deserve. Some of
Mhm.
it, of course, is simply lack of access and the fact that one or two publishers and editors are taking decisions on behalf of a large reading
Mhm.
audience, right?
Okay.
So I don't know. I mean, the books that have been published in translation are not significantly different from the books that have not been published in translation. You know what I mean? They're not like head and shoulders ahead of them or anything like that. And they've been received with a fair amount of excitement and interest and so on. So obviously, I don't expect the reader, the visitor to India who goes to the Taj Mahal to feel the same thing that you and I will when we go to see it, right?
Right.
They should not either. In fact, the whole richness is that there will be quite a different experience of quite a different kind of encounter with the text. And that is the whole point. Why do we want all encounters to fall into the same mold? I would much rather that somebody who lives, halfway across the world reads and finds something extraordinary in a text precisely because it does not belong to their part of the world.
Thank you. If I may, I just want to ask you one more question. Since you have translated such a vast array of works, and they have been very different, right, from each other. So could you tell us a little bit about the translation process that you engage with, your personal translation process, as you translate works that are so very different? What are the commonalities and what are the primary differences when you go to texts that are so hugely different?
The process, as I mentioned earlier already, is exactly the same. I'm led by the text. The fact that I'm not a literary expert, I think, is of great value.
Here you quote Rushdie. Why I didn't, I mean, it's a great thing that I didn't study literature.
Yeah, no, I'm serious. Because then I would have known much more about the texts than I do. And I would have become even more anxious about the fact that I would not be able to take across all the richness that is sort of embedded in the text, not explicitly, but implicitly. I am just led by the language, by what I'm reading in the text. And if that text actually contains within itself 10 different ways of being read, I only hope that my translated text will also be read. It will be capable of being read in 10 different ways. And therefore, for me, that is entirely a matter of just reading the text and taking that across. So I start hearing the text. To be honest, my process is just that. I imagine a voice, not a writerly voice, but someone actually speaking these lines. And in that, I get a sense of fullness of the text, which encompasses its style, its cadences, its choice of words, its construction, its rhythm. And that to me is the challenge in each case. And of course, each writer does it their own way, no doubt about it. In some cases, it's very discernible, mainly because some have signature style. So Kamal Kumar Mojumdar has a signature style. You will always know him. Or some develop a signature style because of the distance in time that has popped up between us and them. And the closer you come to contemporary writers, the differences become much more subtle. So it's really what you're seeing in the text that matters the most. And sometimes it can be as simple as how many words are there in this sentence. What are there internal rhymes? Are there alliterations? And so on. A lot of translators talk to me about some words, and I'm like, don't. I will get an instant headache if you do this to me, because even if I know which words are tatsam and which are not, how will it help me? I mean, what equivalent am I going to look for in the English language? I'm not a linguistic expert in the English language where I can say I will use words only from an Anglo-Saxon background and not use words borrowed from the Romance languages or anything like that. I'm not capable of that. I don't think anyone is. End of the day, you're translating into a language that is a living entity. You're also translating into a language at a particular point of time. And I never give up that idea. So I am not trying to write English. When I'm translating Bankim, I'm not trying to write an English of the 19th century.
Right.
I'm not trying to write, for example, Rajmohan's Wife, a different novel written like Rajmohan's Wife.
Right.
Or the way Rabindranath would have wrote his English, which he did to at great length. So for me, and a person who writes in English and writes in Bangla at the same time will not necessarily go to approach each language with the same sensibility, right? So it would actually be wrong to say, because someone wrote in English also, let me follow their English style in translating them from Bangla.
Achha, okay.
So the Bangla stands for itself and the text stands for itself. And why do we also think that there is going to be tremendous consistency in an author's voice from one book to another. That's actually a kind of poverty, right?
Right.
I mean, one writer who always astounds me every time, because every book I read of hers appears to be written by a different writer, is Bani Boshu.
Exactly. I mean, you can, I mean, I just read like few pages of your translation of this story, Esha and Orko, what's the name? Esha and the one that you were reading. I always forget the name.
Sonamihire
Story
Dipi.
of Esha and where they're going to Elora.
That one, the fifth man, Panchapurush. Panchapurush, fifth
Yeah,
man.
I just read, I mean, I didn't finish it. I've been reading some of it, and I was just thinking that how different that translation would be from if somebody to translate, Shet Pathure Thala for that instance.
Exactly. Yeah. Or Ekushepa and so on. No,
Yes, exactly.
She's incredible. Each book has its own, and each book she chooses an idiom that is perfect for that material. So each text is unique for me. It doesn't even matter to me if it's the same writer, someone whom I've translated before. Now, if it turns out that their styles are similar, well, that's a different matter. But as far as I'm concerned, I'm translating only the book, not the writer.
Thank you so much for your response. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharmitadi. So, do we have questions, comments? Feel free to unmute yourself and speak. I don't see anything in the chat
Can I
box.
ask something?
Yes, please. Who's this?
Aniket.
Yeah, Aniket, go ahead.
So, hello, sir. It was nice to to listen to your conversations with Professor. I had this again question, as you mentioned, one song called Bubble. Going out from this point of the global literary tradition that
Aniket, I can't hear you very clearly, I'm afraid.
Yeah, the voice is muffled. Can you speak once more, Aniket?
Maybe any chance audible?
Do you want to just type out your question, maybe? Might that be easier?
Yes.
I think that will be easier. Aniket is a PhD student. Sorry. Aniket is a PhD student working on Ravi Shankar World here. So
that's
where the question is coming from. But before he, just to give him time to type out his questions, there's something really interesting that you said there, that you imagine it like a voice coming to you. Not the author's voice, but the voice of the text, I assume, or Can you elaborate on that? Because I'm really interested in that idea of hearing that you presented quite centrally as part of your process of translation.
Yes, I find that reading with the eyes alone does not do justice to the text, especially because I'm trying to capture the fullness of the text. And there are effects that a text will achieve, maybe even without the writers aiming for them. And so if that has happened to a text, I need to hear it. Ideally, I would like to see the words scroll on a screen while I'm listening to it and so on. You know what I mean? A kind of three-dimensional textural way of interacting with the text. But the voice is very important because when I hear it, I hear emphasis, I hear tones changing, I can hear lightness, I can hear heaviness, I can hear anger, I can hear all kinds of different states of mind, which sometimes the eye knows they're there, but does not quite get in its fullness. So it's a way of slowing down the reading.
Right. And once you have translated, do you kind of, I mean, logistically speaking, do you keep hearing the translation?
Yeah. I read it out to myself in my head. Right, absolutely. Right. That to me is the far bigger test than the reading of it. So every time I'm revising, I'm actually playing it in my playing the lines in my head.
Aniket, do we have your question? Or maybe you could try speaking once more. Maybe that was just a momentary problem because I don't see anything in the chat box.
Am I audible now?
You are. Let's try once more. Yeah.
So I had this question. I have written almost half of the question in the chat box, but I had this question with drawing on this apparent idea of the global literary tradition in the director's Bengali novels. I had
Aniket, no, I'm afraid we're
Yeah,
still not able to.
yeah, we can't understand. Maybe it's better for you to write it. Yeah, yeah.
Orko, as Aniket writes this question, I have one quick thing, if there is a time.
Sure,
Okay.
sure, sure, sure.
Professor Sinha, you were mentioning about, why you took to translating Shankar as the first of your like major translations. So if time permits today, if you would share the anecdote.
Oh no, that's a very simple thing. When we were starting out the magazine, and we didn't know how to go and approach writers for permission because we were nobodies. So our editor had actually acted in a TV serial based on one of Shankar's stories. So she went and asked him for permission, and he gave it, and I translated it. So that became the first story in the first issue of the magazine. And then later on, when he was looking for a translator for Chorongi, he thought of me because I translated his story.
So he was looking for a translator.
He was looking for a translator at that point, I believe, for a French publisher to read the work in English and then have it translated into French. It was not at that point for publication in English. That actually came much later.
So he asked you then. Okay, that's wonderful.
Yeah, it was as simple as that.
That's wonderful to know.
If I may quickly, as giving more time to Aniket to type out his question, I was kind of wondering, I mean, as you mentioned, there could be a second volume of translation for Sandipan. Do you have some stories or novels in mind for that in case it happens?
No, I'll have to turn to you, Orko. I was reading Shankar Ghosh's introduction, and of course, there are some works he mentions.
Right.
So those possibly. And I think Akok Pradoshoni is something
that's the
that
first novella.
that I'm very interested in, as well as there was one of the novellas which I actually wanted to add, but then the book would get too long, and so I did not. That's I don't recall right now which one it was.
I would, I mean, I don't know which one you might be talking about, but I would definitely recommend one of the two late novels, either Dhangsher Moddhe Diye Jatra or
That's the one. That's the
Nirjana
one.
Gokul.
Dhangsher Moddhe Diye Jatra is the one I was.
Yeah.
Yes.
Those are two really fascinating novels, and again, the way he sort of interweaves the Van Gogh Theo story in Dhangsher Moddhe Diye Jatra and the other one. For a short story, it's kind of incidental, but also slightly funny, I suppose, that the three texts I've written on, at least in English, on Sandipan, none of them have been translated so far. One is Shonali Dana Rigol, the short story. The other is Bharatbarsho, the novel. And then there is Dhangsher Moddhe Diye Jatra and Swarge Nirjana Gokule. So these are the ones I've kind of at least officially written about. There are other things that I've written on Sandipan.
So now that you mention it, I did not know that backstory. I haven't read Swarge Nirjana Gokule, and I didn't know that other story. So I'm just wondering whether it would be interesting to have them in a single volume. The Sharodindu. Is it the Sharodindu Chotogolpo na Upannash?
So he cuts up Raktosondha, the short story, into Swarge Nirjana Gokule.
So it would be interesting to have them
kind of
published together.
Yeah, that will be very
with a note. Orko, let's work on this volume.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I'll do the translation. You work on an essay.
Sure,
I think it would make a fascinating book.
Yeah. I think we have a question from Aniket. Should I read it for you?
No, I've read it.
Okay.
So you're asking, so you're absolutely right. Of course, Ravi Shankar, he and I are exactly the same age, by the way. So, and it was really a blow, his leaving us, because we used to talk a lot, and sometimes he would get very angry with me late at night and fire off some really angry messages for not having responded quickly enough. But yes, so there's montage technique, and he was very much, I'm sure in our conversations, although that showed that he was very much influenced by writers from around the world. I gave him quite a few books to read, and he's one of those writers you translate in a little bit of a trance. He never quite stays at the level of of rational communication or rationally constructing thoughts one after the other. There's a certain internal energy that makes you think that only this sentence could have come after this one. So there's a certain flow. And with Ravi Shankar, I actually found myself translating the first draft very quickly because you were in that trance-like state, and I would just read and type, read and type, read and type, and almost simultaneously read and type sometimes. So it was an extraordinary experience translating him, really. And I was really looking forward to the novel he said he was going to be writing when he very unexpectedly passed away, which was supposed to be about Muhammad.
Thanks for the answer, actually. So
I'm
I
looking
had,
forward to your PhD work on Ravi Shankar.
yeah, sure. So I had another question. So this is a kind of a fanboy question to an extent. So I guess I saw a Facebook post of yours probably after the death of Ravi Shankar Bal. I guess you translated his last work, possibly. Not really his last work, but published last work, Kissa Bol and Shahrazad's a
Just a
draft of
fragment, yes.
just a fragment. So is there a possible chance to get a translation of
I
that by
sincerely
any
hope
chance?
so. Yes,
Okay.
I would very much like to do it.
I see. Okay. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot
We
for
can
that.
hear you clearly now. Maybe
Yeah.
turning on the
I
camera did
changed
the
the
trick.
headphone actually.
Okay.
Yeah, now it's clear. And of course, feel free to reach out to Professor Sinha if you have questions about his interactions with Ravi Shankar Bal since you're working on him. I think it'll be nice to get a
Of
sense of
course, anytime.
that interaction. Okay, thank you, Aniket. Do we have any more questions? I'm aware of time, so perhaps we could take one last question from the audience. Feel free to unmute yourself and or chat, you could type your question in the chat box. In fact, just giving it a minute for questions to be formed, maybe. Another thing that I've always found fascinating, just to go back to Sandipan, is yeah, to the extent, and that's what I was kind of indicating at the beginning, that he has often been considered too European. And that's the irony that we were discussing. Perhaps one of the problems of translating, or one of the practical problems of acceptance with translations of his works, is the fact that he's too European. I still remember when I was writing that paper on Shonalidana Rigol that eventually came out in Interventions, I was looking at the reception and I saw, was it Shyamul Gangopadhyay or maybe Shankar Ghosh or one of them, reviewing that short story because it came out as a mini book in the book fair first. And it was called a foreign story. This is exactly the word that was used, a foreign story. Not Boideshi Golpo, foreign Golpo. Ekti foreign Golpo, something like that. And it was very interesting. I can't remember who said or who used that word. But anyway, it's a fascinating story about a man who believes that he's Jack the Reaper and a golden eagle. So that weird combination of both. And again, it's a story that works at so many different levels. Sexuality is involved, but it's only one of the many layers. In fact, what it does, and that's what I was interested in that particular story, is the way it imagines the function of literature, almost like a sickness that literature transmits a medical symptom. It's a very interesting characterization because it's a predominantly negative characterization of literature. To put it simply, I read something, I go mad, I harm myself, something like that. And that was the idea that, in a very chilly way, the story was sort of offering, as it were, among other things, of course. But anyway, I think unless there are questions, we could stop here and let me thank Arunava once more. And maybe if you would want to show the book once by unblurring your background, that
All
would
right,
be
yes.
great. Right.
Meanwhile, thank you, Orko, and thanks to everybody for being here.
And I really hope we have more readers of Sandipan through this wonderful translation that I'm still
Fingers
in the
crossed.
process of reading.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thank
so
you
much,
so much.
Arunava, for your time.
Thank
so
you.
much.
Thank you, everyone. Bye. Good
Thank
night.
you, everyone. Bye-bye. Night.
Bye.